We have had some challenges this week, but we are not defeated. We are more than conquerors through Christ who loved us. Amen? God has given us a promise. He said, this life is not all there is. I have reserved for you, I am preparing a place for you, and I will come back and take you to be with me, is what he says. And he says there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. Not life, not death, not principalities. Nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. So he says we are indeed more than conquerors. And so we take great joy and peace in that. Because we've got good news, and good news needs to be shared. And on October the 13th, what are we doing? Meeting in the park. We're meeting in the park. It's going to be a fun day. But it's a day to bring your friends, bring your family, especially people that don't know Christ yet. Be a marvelous opportunity to introduce them to Christ, to God's church, and have a good time while we're at it. We have a lot of prayer requests, people that you're inviting, that you've told us, please pray for these people and pray for me as I invite them, that God's will be done, God's name will be known, God's presence will be praised by your guests. And we are praying over these every day. Please, if there's somebody else you want to add to that list, there's more cards just like this out here on these tables and some baskets to put those in. Add to the list. We'll be glad to pray for those. God is up to things. We want to see what he's doing. So there was a couple. They're getting ready for a fancy night out. They had chosen a kind of exclusive place to go dine and then have a special night out, just the two of them. They were dressing up. They got all ready for their special night. They called a cab, hired a cab to come pick them up and chauffeur them around. And as the time got ready, they got all dressed. When they put the cat out, and then they finished their jobs, but when they opened the door to walk out to the cab, the cat ran back in the house. They didn't want to keep the cab waiting and risk losing the cab, so the husband said, dear, you go out and hold the cab. I'll go back in the house and get the cat. They didn't want to leave it in. They're going to be gone all night. They didn't want to leave the cat in the house. So he went back in. But when she got to the cab, she realized, I don't want this cab driver to know that this house is going to be empty all night long. And so she thought, she said, my husband will be back in just a few minutes. He went back inside to say goodbye to my mother. A few minutes later, he came back out, got in the car, sat down and said, I'm sorry that took so long. The stupid old thing had crawled under the bed and I had to poke her with a coat hanger to get her out. You know, sometimes it's hard to get people moving. Maybe it takes a coat hanger. Maybe it takes something to get us to move. But that's why we need to be attentive to God's call to us. We need to be open to God's calling. We sometimes think about calling as a special situation. God only calls certain people. But I want to share with you, again, God's call is normative. He calls everyone. We just don't all answer the call. Unless we're listening, unless we're ready to pick up that phone, unless we're ready to follow the call. And sometimes it's hard to follow that call, and sometimes we don't even pick up the phone. But there's a purpose. God calls his people with a purpose. He didn't just put us here to twiddle our thumbs and spend our time and talk about the weather. He put us here on mission. He's got a purpose for us to live. But sometimes we get a call, we realize the call, we recognize the call, but we're hesitant to pick up the phone or to answer that call. We've been studying what it means to be called. We've looked at Abraham, the call that God gave to Abraham, and realized how that's a similar call that he gives to each one of us to go. We've looked at the call that he gave to Moses and how Moses tried to dodge the call over and over. And we do that too sometimes, don't we? Today I want to share with you the call of Esther. We're going to be in Esther chapter 4, if you want to get your Bibles and look at that. This is a story, this is a book that is just, it's a fun read. It's almost laid out like a melodrama. But the way we see God at work here is nothing short of amazing. And the way we see God's call dealt with, questioned, and then followed is amazing. So I want to set a little bit of context before we get to chapter 4. The book is set in the time just after the captivity, which means the Israelites who lived in Israel, Jerusalem, and that country, the Canaan, the promised land, they had been disobedient to God. God had given them chance over chance over chance. They didn't take the chances to be obedient. And so God punished them by sending in the Babylonians to destroy their cities and carry them off into captivity far across the desert in Babylon, in that land. So people stayed there in captivity for 70 years until the Medes came in, the Median Empire. They came in, they defeated the Babylonians, they took over, and after they came in, the Medes allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. But some of them didn't. For some reason, some of the Jews, they maybe settled in, maybe they were raising crops, they had families there, they chose to stay, some of them. And so we see that there's this remnant of people left in Babylon. Now, Babylon was ruled by a man at this time named Artaxerxes. Not Artaxerxes, that was his son. This was Xerxes. Say that one, Xerxes. And if you're about to have a child, you might want to consider that on your name list. Xerxes. Maybe not. Xerxes was the most powerful man in the world. And Xerxes knew how to throw a good party. And he loved a good party. As a matter of fact, he called all of his rulers, all of his governors together, and he threw a party that lasted 6 months. 6 months. Now that's a party. And after the party, that wasn't enough. He threw an after party that lasted for 7 days, at which time he encouraged all the people attending to drink as much as they wanted. And guess what they did? They drank as much as they wanted, including Artaxerxes. And after 7 days, he was well inebriated, and he decided to call in his beautiful queen, Queen Vashti, to come and show off this beautiful queen to all these other men. Imagine somebody doing that. She declined. She said, no, thank you. I don't think I'll come parade in front of all these drunk men. I'm not going to do that. Xerxes was furious, and he counseled with his other rulers, and they said, Xerxes, if you let her get away from this, if you let her get away with disobeying you, then all of our wives are going to think they can disobey us, and it'll be bedlam in the kingdom. You've got to handle this. And so he did. He banished his queen, took away her role, took away her title, but now he has no queen. And so he's got to come up with another queen. His rulers got around him and said, do this. Find the most beautiful woman in each of your provinces. That was 127 provinces. You find 127 of the most beautiful women in the whole kingdom. You bring them here. You give them beauty treatments for a year. And then you pick the one you like the best. He thought that was a good idea. He said, do it. And so they did. They went throughout the whole kingdom. They picked out 127 virgins, brought them against their will to be part of the king's harem. They would be part of the king's harem for the rest of their lives. But one of them was going to get to be queen. One of the girls chosen was a Jewish girl by the name of Esther. Esther was beautiful. She came in. She's not only beautiful in appearance, but beautiful in heart, beautiful in spirit, beautiful in soul, and people loved her. And they helped her, and they guided her. And after a year, she won the beauty pageant. And she became queen. Now, one of Xerxes' most important counselors, though, one of his counselors, the guy who sat at his right hand, was named Haman. Now, Haman came from a people, his descendants were enemies of the Jews. For centuries, they had been enemies. And it's fascinating. Haman had never had a run-in with a Jew, but he still hated the Jews. Just because they knew that his grandfather hated the Jews and his great-grandfather hated the Jews, so he did too. But Haman was an egomaniac. He wanted people to recognize him. And so when he walked through the city, he wanted people to bow to him. But there was one man who would not bow, and that was Mordecai. Mordecai turned out to be Esther's cousin who had adopted her when her parents died. Her parents were some of those who chose to stay in Babylon instead of going back to Jerusalem, but they died and left her parentless, and her cousin Mordecai adopted her. Mordecai had a position with the king. He served in the king's court. So it's kind of a high official, if you want, in the king's court. Mordecai was a faithful man and would not bow to anybody except for God himself. He would not bow to Haman. And this infuriated Haman. And Haman was so angry, he was not content just to do something against Mordecai. He decided he wanted to annihilate all the Jewish people in that land. And so through a series of manipulative coercions, he got the king, Xerxes, to sign an edict that said on a certain day in the future, all the Jews in the kingdom would be fair game for annihilation, kill them, and you can have all their stuff. You can take all their stuff. When the news got to Mordecai, he ripped his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes, as did all the rest of the people in Babylon and all through the country. When they heard the news that the king had essentially ordered their destruction, they mourned and they wept. Mordecai was sitting by the city gates. He couldn't go into the gate of the palace because he was wearing ashes and weeping and wearing sackcloth. Esther heard about this, that he was wearing these tacky old clothes, that he was downcast in his soul and his spirit. And so she sent her aide, her servant, out with some nice clothes to give to Mordecai and said, "Why are you so sad?" See, the interesting thing is, she didn't know. She was locked up inside the palace, living a pampered life, completely unaware of what was going on the outside. Mordecai sent back this message to her explaining the whole thing and imploring, begging her to go before the king and plead for her people. And that's where we pick up the story in chapter 4. Starting verse 7. Let's look at this. Mordecai told Esther's aide, her servant, everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and to explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Now, up to this point, Mordecai had warned Esther, don't tell them you're a Jew. Don't let them know about your ethnicity. Keep that under wraps right now. But now, he's saying, it's time to come out of the closet, Esther. It's time to make yourself known and plead for these people. But there was a good reason for her not to take the call. The story goes on. Hathach, the servant of Esther, went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death. Unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But it's been 30 days since the king called my name. It's been 30 days since I've seen him. Now you might think that just because Esther was queen, she could just waltz into the throne room anytime, have a seat down by the king and say, hey, what's happening? Did you ever think about doing this? Well, that's not the case. That's not the kind of queen Esther was. That's not the kind of queen they had in Babylon. Esther, you might think, was more the queen of the harem. She was like the top, what do you call those people who live in a harem? Concubines. She was the hottie in the harem. She was the one that had all the king's favor. And so she was kind of the ruler of the harem, telling the girls where to go. But she was really a prisoner in the palace, under the king's whim. And she says to him, listen, I can't just waltz in there. And you know what? He had a harem. He had a harem before he brought in the 127 virgins from around the country. He had scores of other women to choose, and she said to him, I haven't been called in 30 days. In other words, she's saying, Mordecai, I'm not the flavor of the month. I'm not the one he's interested in right now. I cannot go before him without risking my life. In that culture, the only thing worse than not showing up when you were summoned by the king is showing up when you're not summoned by the king. Esther knew this. But now comes one of the most powerful statements I think there is in the Old Testament, as Mordecai reminds her what's really going on. He says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer, Esther, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. What Mordecai is saying is, Esther, you know all those coincidences that have happened in your life? Your parents stayed here. They didn't move back. Your parents died. I adopted you. I seem to have a position in the king's royal court. All these things that start happening, you get chosen out of all the other women in the province. You get chosen out of all the other ones who were chosen out of their provinces. Out of 127, you get to be the one. Do you think it's all coincidences? Or do you think that maybe God has led up to something? You think that maybe God has been in part in the middle of this whole time? What Mordecai is saying is that all these coincidences are really the providence of God working, setting up the scene, putting her into a place that she never wanted, putting her into a place that was against her will, locking her into a situation that was not good. But here's the thing. He said, you're not there because of what the king thinks you're there for. You're really there for what God has put you there for. God has manipulated, God has worked, God has planned. This is not an accident. And so God's calling, ring, ring. Esther, I've brought you to this moment. Will you answer the call? And look how she replies. Esther was raised by Mordecai, who would not bow to Haman. Guess how she replies? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, that was the capital city they were living in, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. I got to stand back and say, that woman, she got guts. She's got an understanding that this is not all about her. She realized that her whole life was a calling by God to work up to this very moment. And now she's going to go and be obedient to that calling. Now, I want you to go home today and read the rest of the story. It is a beautiful story about how God works and the wisdom and the heart of Esther as she works for the king and the way it all turns out, the ironies that play out in the story. It's very fun. But the question has to be asked, how does Esther's call relate to us today? What does her situation in the palace of ancient Babylon have anything to do with our situations today? And I think it has a lot. Because Esther was made with a purpose, but there was a danger that she would default to a different mission than what God had called her to. Esther's call was to a certain work, but she had to change her method of operation to follow it. And here's what we do. We are called people. God's people are called for a purpose. The very word church means the called. The ones who are called out of the world, the ones who are called to make a difference, the ones who are called to stand up for Christ. And if you don't embrace your purpose that God has called you for, you will quickly adopt a substitute mission, a default mission, if you will. I believe that there's a warning that the book of Esther gives to us. This warning is simply this: beware the seduction of the default mission. The default mission is the place that your life drifts to if it's not purposefully steered to the real mission. It is the natural way that our lives go. It is the natural tendencies that we adopt. And it's not always godly. It's most always a little self-centered. And if we don't adopt God's call for us, this is where we drift to our default mission. There's a story heard about two old men in Walmart. They're pushing their carts around, and they run into each other, bump their carts, and one man says, I'm sorry, I'm looking for my wife. I can't find her. And the other old man says, I was looking for my wife too. The first guy says, well, what does your wife look like? Oh, she is 27. She's tall. She's got long red hair, bright green eyes. She is beautiful. What about your wife? What does she look like? The second guy says, it doesn't matter what my wife looks like. Let's find yours. And you see how quickly we can get distracted from the mission that God has called us to, and we drift to a default mission that often centers around us instead of around God. It's so easy for us to get off mission. Xerxes had a mission. He was called to be a good king of a great kingdom, but instead he drifted to a default mission of seeking his own pleasure. Haman had a mission to be a counselor to this great king, to help him rule this mighty kingdom, but he drifted to a default mission of making himself look good. and feeling good about himself and being honored by all the people. He had this ego the size of Babylon. Esther had a default mission. She could have sold out God's mission for the default so easily. She could have lived out the rest of her life in a pampered life, in a soft life, in an easy life, a secure life. But she chose the mission that God gave to her. The Bible's full of warnings about default missions. Jesus tells a story about a man who had a great year. His crops, they bore more than he could even handle in his barns. And so you would think, here's an obvious situation where you can be generous and give and help the poor. But what this guy did was to drift to his default mission, and he built bigger barns to hold all of his stuff so he could retire and live in ease the rest of his life. And the Bible calls him a fool. Instead of being rich towards others, he was only rich to himself. But that was his default. Not answering the call of God to look outside of myself. And I have to ask, we have to ask, what is your default mission? Where do you drift to by nature? What is our natural inclination? It's usually not to the call of God. That's something we have to answer on purpose. So 3 things I want to share with you about this call that Esther received. And then it'll be yours. Number 1, Esther, at this time, today, God has a purpose for you. Right now, he told Esther, he said, who knows but what God raised you up for this moment, for this time. And it's important to understand, at this time, there was a moment in time for Esther, but when did that moment start? It started when her parents chose to stay in Babylon. It happened before she was born. God had called her, and then God shaped her, and God moved her. And all those shapings, all those choices she made all along the way opened the door for her to be chosen to save all of her people. But it wasn't just that moment. It was everything leading up to it. And we had the same calling on our lives. To follow God, to honor him. Why did she make that godly response? Because she had grown up in that home of Mordecai, who fed that into her and helped her to know what it was to follow God. Esther had good reason not to like her situation, though. She could have complained about it. She could have said, why didn't my parents move back to Jerusalem? Why didn't they take me back there? Why did they have to die? God, why did you let this happen to me? And my cousin, he's just my cousin. Why did all this happen to me? And I got chosen, not because I wanted it, but they drugged me away from my family. They put me in this harem. I'm a vassal of the king. She had reason not to like her situation. And I know many of us do too. And we can make the arguments. We can make the complaints. God, why did you let this happen? Some of it's because of our own choices. Sometimes we make choices that just put us into a hole. But sometimes it's choices that other people make that we have no control of, but they still hurt us. And we could complain to God, but maybe instead of complaining to God about our situations, we should open our eyes to what God might be doing to shape us in that moment to follow his mission instead of our mission. Right now, God has a mission for your life. It's not when you're going to wake up someday and hear this knock on the door and say, here it is, there's your mission. He's shaping it now. He's using it now. Every person you meet, every person you talk to, you are a picture of Christ as you go out into the world. And he's calling you on his mission, not your mission. Number 2, at no time is God hindered by my reluctance to adopt his mission. At no time will my answering no or my ignoring the call, will that hinder God's mission. God doesn't need me. He doesn't need you. Sometimes we say that, but we think that he does. Sometimes we think we're irreplaceable. But God wants you. And that's a different thing. He wants me. And he wants me to partner with him. But if I choose not to, God's will is going to be accomplished. It's what he told Esther. He says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come from another place. Mordecai didn't know what that was. He just knew that God had made a promise and God was going to carry it out, and none of our feeble yeses or nos were going to get in the way. But he gave us the opportunity to partner with him. Think about that. You get to partner with God on his mission. He calls us to that. We have to answer yes or no. And if I answer no, God will say, I'm sorry for your sake, because you're going to miss out on all the blessing of walking with me and seeing the fruit that comes from this. You're going to miss the joy of partnering with the God of all creation. You're going to miss the joy of the power at work in your life. But he gives us that freedom. I have to know God's not waiting for me. He's doing his work right now. And he's asking me to join him. And so I need to answer the call. Do I look for his mission, or do I default to my mission? Do I search to see what God is doing and join him on what he's doing? And maybe we were waiting for some big note on the door or something, a big banner, a skywriting to say, lightning, say, do this. And maybe it's just something in the Bible that we've read about, I don't know, forgiving those who've hurt us. Maybe it's about taking care of the poor. Maybe it's about loving our neighbors as our own selves. Maybe it's something as simple as be studiers. Study the word to show yourself a good student of the word, handling the word rightly. Maybe it's prayer. Maybe it's encouraging other people. We don't know always what God is doing, but when we start seeking his way, God, what do you want me to do today? I am your servant. Use me as you wish. None of us are indispensable, but we're all capable of experiencing the joy of partnering with God. And number 3, at all times, and say this with me, at all times, I need others to keep me on the mission of God. It is amazing. I'm so impressed with myself. I have the ability to deceive myself like nobody else. I can lie to myself, and guess what? I believe it. I believe it. And I need somebody with some clearer vision to step into my life and to say, Doug, wait a minute. Think about this. I can't always see what I'm doing. I'm a little too close to the forest to see the trees. Or is it the other way around? I don't know. I have trouble seeing sometimes, and I'm great at self-deception, and I need other people around me. That's why the Proverbs say, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. He calls us into relationship so that we can keep each other on mission. That's why it's important to come to church. Just listening to the radio again this morning, I hear this question. Listen to the Jesus Christ show on Sunday mornings. It's fascinating stories sometimes. But all the time, this question gets asked. Do I have to go to church to be a Christian? Do I have to go to church to be saved? Do I have to be a part of an organized religion? Can I just go out and God? Can't I just be myself? No. God built his church, and he gave it to us for a reason, because we need other people to help us to see what we're doing or not doing. We need people we can trust. And the type of conversations you have out in the foyer as you're passing in the hall, hi, how are you, fine? Those are not the kind of conversations you need. That's why we encourage people to be a part of a small group where you can meet with some people on a consistent basis, build some relationship, and learn to hold each other accountable and to encourage each other and to build each other up and to stay on point, to stay on mission for God instead of falling prey to the default mission of ourselves. We need to be with other people. Jesus said this. He said this because our default mission nearly always avoids the cross. What happened on the cross? Jesus did what? Died. He died on the cross. And he says, pick up your cross and follow me. In other words, he says, die to yourself and follow me. Put me first. He says in Matthew 16, he said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. That's why we're looking at these verses, this idea of discipleship. What does it mean to be a follower? Not just a fan, not just somebody who goes, rah, rah, God, I like God, but somebody who actually follows him and does what he does. He says, verse 25 says, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. And then he says, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? The message, I believe, of Esther is to beware of the default mission. It's always lurking there. It's always ready to capture our attention and to say, me, me, me. Do it my way. Do what I want. And God calls us to something bigger than that. We're going to sing a song. This song convicts me every time I sing it. It says, oh God, you are my God, and I will follow you all the days of my life. And step by step, you will lead me. This is a prayer that we're going to sing. It says to him, I am done with myself. I'm done with the default mission. I want to be on point for your mission. I will follow you every step of the way. Just lead me. If you're tired of defaulting on your mission, our elders are staying back here saying, let's go to God and pray about it. If you have drifted to the default and started thinking more about yourself and your schedule and your time and what you want, instead of seeking God's mission, we need to go to him in prayer. And guess what? He's waiting. He won't avoid the call. He'll listen to that call, and he'll answer that call to help you. But if you've never given your life to Christ in the first place, this is a great time to do it. We're going to sing the song. You can come down here, have a seat, and we'll help to baptize you into Jesus Christ, to walk in him, filled with his Spirit, on his point, on his mission for the rest of your life. If we can do that, then come down here while we stand and sing this song.